Greek mythology never really ended. It settled into language instead, tucked so deeply into everyday words that most people use pieces of it without ever noticing. Take the word tantalize. Anyone who has felt tantalized by something just out of reach is unknowingly borrowing the name of Tantalus, a mortal condemned to stand in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, the water always receding when he bent to drink, the branches always lifting when he reached to eat. Or take narcissist. The word comes from a young man named Narcissus, who fell so completely in love with his own reflection in a still pool of water that he could never bring himself to look away from it. Pan gave the world panic. He was a goat-legged god of wild places, and his sudden, unexplainable appearance was said to grip travelers with a sudden, overwhelming fear, especially in lonely mountain passes far from any town. Hypnos gave the world hypnosis. He was the quiet god of sleep. Imagine living in a dim cave near the western edge of the world. A cave so still that no rooster crowed there and no branch stirred loudly enough to disturb him. His son Morpheus, who could take the shape of any person inside a sleeper's dream, gave his name to morphine, though not directly through myth. A German chemist named Friedrich Serturner isolated the compound in the early 1800s and chose the name himself, reaching for Morpheus because of the deep, dream-heavy sleep the drug produces, a naming decision made by one scientist rather than something that simply drifted down from antiquity on its own. Chaos gave the world chaos, though the meaning shifted along the way. In Hesiod's account of creation, the very first thing to exist, chaos meant something closer to a yawning gap or open chasm than to noise and disorder. Only later, as the word passed through Latin and into other European languages, did it settle into the sense of confusion most people know today. The Muses gave the world museum. A Mausion was originally a shrine or gathering place set aside for the 9 goddesses who were said to inspire poetry, music, dance, history, and astronomy, long before the word came to mean a building full of preserved objects. Echo gave the world the word for her own fading voice. She was a nymph, cursed to repeat only the last words spoken to her, unable to originate speech of her own. And she faded eventually into nothing but a voice bouncing back off distant walls and cliffs. The Titans gave the world Titanic, a word for anything of overwhelming size, borrowed from the enormous generation of gods who ruled the cosmos before the Olympians overthrew them. The doomed ship that sank in 1912 carried that same name, chosen specifically to evoke unmatched scale and strength, a choice that reads very differently in hindsight. Achilles gave the world the Achilles heel, the single point of vulnerability hidden inside an otherwise formidable strength. It is worth flagging early that this specific detail, the one unprotected heel, is not something Homer describes in the Iliad at all. It developed more fully in later retellings, especially Roman-era ones, centuries after Homer composed his poem. Odysseus gave the world Odyssey, now used for any long and eventful journey, borrowed from his own 10 years spent finding a way home after a war that had already lasted a decade. And Nemesis gave the world Nemesis. Most people using the word today have no idea they are naming an actual goddess, one who specialized in punishing excessive pride and good fortune left unchecked by any humility. A few more words are worth adding to this same opening list. Proteus, an old shape-shifting sea god capable of taking any form to avoid answering questions, gave English the adjective protean, still used for anyone or anything that changes shape or role easily. Stentor, a Greek herald at Troy whose voice was said to carry as loudly as 50 men shouting together, gave English stentorian, a word for any exceptionally loud or powerful voice. And the labyrinth built to contain the Minotaur, already waiting to be told in fuller form shortly, gave English labyrinthine, now used for anything as tangled and difficult to navigate as that original maze. That is already a dozen fully distinct facts, gathered from 12 completely different corners of the mythology, and this account will return to language again later, once there has been a chance to meet the gods, monsters, and heroes these words originally belonged to. Before any of the Olympian gods existed, the Greeks imagined a much stranger and more abstract world at the start of everything. The very first thing to exist was chaos, that yawning gap already mentioned. Out of it came 4 beings without any parent at all: Gaia, the earth; Tartarus, a deep pit lying so far beneath the ground that Hesiod said a bronze anvil dropped from the sky would fall for 9 full days before reaching it, and then 9 more before reaching Tartarus itself; Eros, desire; and, alongside Erebus, darkness, came Nyx, the night, mother eventually of Hypnos, and so many other figures tied to sleep and dreaming. Gaia and Uranus, the earth and the starry sky, became parents to the 12 Titans, a generation far less familiar today than their Olympian children. Oceanus and Tethys were imagined as the source of every river and stream on earth. Hyperion and Theia became the parents of the sun, moon, and dawn. Cronus, the youngest of the Titan sons, would eventually rule the cosmos for an entire age. Gaia and Uranus had stranger children too. 3 sons, the Cyclopes, were born with a single enormous eye each, and 3 more, the Hecatoncheires, were born with 50 heads and 100 arms apiece. Their combined strength said to rival the earth and sky together. Uranus found these 6 unbearable to look at, and hid them away inside the earth, a decision that caused Gaia real and lasting pain. Gaia eventually turned to her Titan children for help, and only Cronus agreed to act, cutting his father down with a sickle his mother had made and taking the throne for himself. Cronus, once in power, made his own troubling choice. Rather than free the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires as Gaia had hoped, he left them exactly where his father had put them and settled into rule alongside his sister and wife Rhea. That single decision, an act of liberation that turned into a second imprisonment, set the stage for everything that followed among the gods. One point of confusion is worth clearing up here, since it trips up even careful readers. Cronus, the youngest Titan and eventual ruler of the cosmos, is a completely different figure from Kronos, a personification of time itself that appears in some later philosophical and mystical traditions, above all among the Orphics, who told their own separate creation story with Kronos rather than chaos, standing at the very beginning of everything. The 2 names sound alike in English translation and were sometimes blended together in later Greek and Roman art, which is largely why the image of an old man with a scythe, more properly Cronus carrying the same sickle he used against his father, eventually came to double as a symbol of time passing, an association that still lingers in the modern figure of Father Time. Gaia held one more role worth mentioning before moving on to her grandchildren's generation. Long before Apollo claimed it, the oracle at Delphi was said to have belonged to Gaia herself, the earth speaking directly through the same fissure in the rock that later poets attributed to Apollo's priestess, fitting naturally with Gaia's broader identity as a source of hidden knowledge welling up from beneath the ground. Tradition generally describes the site passing through one more set of hands before Apollo's arrival, held for a time by Themis, a titaness associated with divine law, order, and custom, whose own name survives today in the modern legal concept of Themis as an underlying principle of justice, giving the oracle at Delphi, across its full history, 3 distinct divine keepers in succession: Gaia, then Themis, then finally Apollo. Cronus, once in power, faced a warning of his own, that he was destined to be overthrown by one of his own children, exactly as he had overthrown his father. His solution was to swallow each child whole the moment it was born, keeping 5 of them, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, trapped, but alive inside his own body. His wife Rhea saved her 6th child, Zeus, by giving birth in secret on Crete and handing Cronus a large stone wrapped in cloth to swallow in the infant's place, a trick effective enough that Cronus reportedly never noticed the substitution until Zeus, grown to adulthood, forced him to bring up everything he had swallowed years before. With his siblings freed and the Titans defeated in the long war that followed, Zeus became king of the gods, and the family that gathered around him on Mount Olympus is worth meeting one at a time. Zeus ruled the sky, carried the eagle as his sacred bird, and was linked to the oak tree. Above all, an ancient oak at Dodona, whose rustling leaves priests interpreted as messages from the god himself. His romantic life was extensive and often approached in unusual forms. He came to Danae as a shower of golden light, to Leda disguised as a swan, and to Europa disguised as a gentle white bull, an abduction that gave an entire continent its name. Hera, his wife, governed marriage and family, an ironic pairing given how much of her own story involved her husband's infidelity rather than domestic harmony. She favored the peacock, its tail said to carry the 100 eyes of a giant watchman she had once employed, and Homer repeatedly describes her as ox-eyed, a genuine compliment referring to large, striking eyes rather than any resemblance to cattle. Her most significant center of worship stood on the island of Samos, where the Horion, a temple built in her honor, ranks among the oldest monumental stone temples anywhere in the Greek world, with the site's religious use stretching back long before the more famous structures later built in Athens and elsewhere. Poseidon ruled the sea, carried a trident capable of summoning storms or shaking the earth, and was closely associated with horses, said to have created the very first one by striking a rock during a contest with Athena over the patronage of Athens, a contest he lost when the city preferred her gift of the olive tree. Athena was born fully grown from Zeus's own skull, already dressed in armor, and became goddess of strategic warfare and craft rather than the more chaotic violence associated with her brother Ares. Her sacred bird was the owl, prized for keen night vision, and her sacred tree was the olive, the same one that had won her Athens. Apollo carried an unusually wide portfolio for a single god: music, poetry, prophecy, healing, archery, and, in later tradition, the sun. He was also known by the epithet Phoebus, meaning bright or shining, used so consistently alongside his given name in ancient poetry that the two together, Phoebus Apollo, became something close to a fixed formal title in their own right. Artemis, his twin sister, governed the hunt and wild places, fiercely protective of her independence, closely associated with the moon in later tradition and with a band of nymphs who had sworn alongside her to remain unmarried. Hermes, born to the nymph Maia, served as messenger of the gods, recognizable by winged sandals and a winged helmet. He was said to have invented the lyre from a tortoise shell on the very day of his birth, a cleverness that occasionally tipped over into outright mischief, since that same day also saw him steal a herd of cattle from his own brother Apollo. Hephaestus, god of the forge, crafted many of the god's most famous possessions, including Zeus's own thunderbolts, working from a workshop later, tradition placed beneath Mount Etna. He was born with a physical difference affecting his legs, and one version of his origin describes Hera, ashamed of his appearance, casting him down from Olympus, a story that sits uneasily alongside the generous, even-tempered character he displays throughout most of the rest of Greek mythology. Aphrodite's own origin splits along a genuine fault line in the tradition. One tradition describes her rising fully formed from sea foam near Cyprus, older by lineage than most of the Olympians. A separate, equally old tradition simply names her a daughter of Zeus, born generations later. Ancient sources never fully reconcile the two versions, and modern classicists tend to treat both as genuine parts of a living tradition rather than trying to declare one correct. Aphrodite also owned a magical girdle, a woven belt said to make anyone who saw its wearer fall instantly and helplessly in love, a piece of enchanted clothing significant enough to the story that even Hera, on at least one occasion, borrowed it from Aphrodite directly in order to distract Zeus for her own purposes. Ares, god of war in its more chaotic, bloodier form, was never as broadly beloved among the Greeks as most of his siblings, though his standing varied by region, honored with real seriousness in militaristic Sparta, even while receiving comparatively little dedicated worship in Athens and many other city-states. Demeter governed the harvest, and her daughter Persephone's abduction by Hades, followed by a compromise negotiated once Demeter's grief had left the earth barren with famine, split Persephone's year between the two realms and gave the Greeks their explanation for the changing seasons. The exact split varies by source. Most people today cite 6 months below ground for 6 pomegranate seeds eaten during her time there, but the earliest surviving versions actually describe a third of the year rather than half, a discrepancy scholars have never fully resolved, likely because the story circulated in more than one regional version rather than a single authoritative account. Persephone herself carried 2 names: Kore, simply the maiden before her abduction, and Persephone, her more formal title as Queen of the Underworld. Afterward, during her search for her missing daughter, Demeter was also said to have taught the art of agriculture to a young prince named Triptolemus in gratitude for his family's kindness toward her, sending him out across the world on a chariot pulled by winged serpents to spread the knowledge of farming to humanity at large, a quieter, more constructive myth than her grief-driven search for Persephone. But one the Greeks connected just as closely to her overall identity as goddess of the harvest. Dionysus, god of wine and festivity, was the only Olympian born to a mortal mother, and his worship carried an intensity that unsettled even some of the Greeks who practiced it. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, held a domain so quiet by comparison that she rarely appears as an active character in any surviving myth at all. And some later traditions describe her voluntarily giving up her seat among the 12 to make room for Dionysus. One small correction is worth making here, since it is one of the most commonly repeated mix-ups connected to the entire Olympian family. The symbol most people picture for medicine today, a staff with 2 snakes coiled around it and a pair of wings at the top, is not actually a medical symbol from Greek mythology at all. That image is the caduceus, carried by Hermes as messenger of the gods. The real ancient symbol of healing is the rod of Asclepius, god of medicine and a son of Apollo, which has only a single snake and no wings. And modern medical organizations remain split on which image they actually use, with a considerable number mistakenly adopting Hermes' staff instead of the one that actually belonged to the god of healing. Hephaestus' workshop produced more than weapons and jewelry. He was credited with building bronze servants, said to move and even speak with something resembling independent thought to help him at his forge, and with constructing Talos, an enormous bronze giant that circled the island of Crete 3 times daily to guard it from invaders. Animated by a single vein of divine fluid running from his neck down to one vulnerable ankle, a design Medea would later exploit to disable him during Jason and the Argonauts' voyage home. Beyond the 12, an entire second tier of gods and spirits filled out the Greek imagination, some of them appearing constantly across countless local stories without ever anchoring a full epic of their own. The 9 Muses, daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, whose name means memory, each governed a different art: Calliope for epic poetry, Clio for history, Euterpe for music, Thalia for comedy, Melpomene for tragedy, Terpsichore for dance, Erato for love poetry, Polyhymnia for sacred hymns, and Urania for astronomy. Poets across the ancient world routinely opened their major works by asking one of the 9 for guidance, a convention old enough to shape the opening lines of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Hecate, associated with magic, crossroads, and the moon in certain contexts, guided Demeter with a torch through the darkness, while the grieving goddess searched for her missing daughter, and she later became closely tied to witchcraft in both ancient and later folklore. Iris, goddess of the rainbow, served alongside Hermes as a divine messenger, and rainbows themselves were popularly understood as the visible trace of her passage between the mortal and divine worlds. Nike, goddess of victory, lent her name directly to the modern athletic brand, chosen specifically to evoke triumph, and her winged, wind-caught image influenced the design of countless later victory monuments that had no connection to Greek religion at all. Nymphs divided into several categories depending on which part of the landscape they inhabited. Dryads bound to individual trees, naiads presiding over freshwater springs, Oreads dwelling among mountains, and the 50 Nereids populating the Mediterranean, daughters of the sea god Nereus, among them Thetis, whose wedding to a mortal king would later set the Trojan War in motion. Nereus himself carried the title Old Man of the Sea, a gentle, wise, and generally truthful figure, distinct from the more mischievous Proteus already introduced, said to preside quietly over his own coral palace on the ocean floor alongside Poseidon, whose own royal residence beneath the waves was imagined built entirely of gold, its stables housing the golden-maned horses that pulled his chariot smoothly across the surface of the sea whenever he chose to travel above ground. Centaurs, with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a horse, were generally portrayed as wild and unruly, with one clear exception. Chiron, a centaur renowned for wisdom and healing rather than chaos, tutored an impressive roster of heroes, including Achilles, Jason, and Heracles. Chiron's own story ends with real generosity. Wounded by accident with a poison that caused him unending pain he could not cure even with his own medical knowledge, and unable to die because he was immortal, he eventually arranged to trade his immortality away entirely in exchange for the release of Prometheus. Still chained to his mountain at that point in the wider timeline, giving up his own long life so that another suffering figure could finally be set free. Satyrs, companions of Dionysus with the legs and tail of a goat, embodied a similarly untamed energy, and their presence in Greek drama gave rise to an entire theatrical genre, the satyr play, performed alongside tragedies specifically to offer audiences something lighter after the heavier material that came before it. And Pan himself deserves one more mention beyond the origin of the word panic. He fell in love with a nymph named Syrinx, who prayed to escape his pursuit and was transformed into a stand of hollow reeds just as he reached her. Moved by the sound the wind made passing through them, Pan cut several reeds to different lengths and bound them together, creating the panpipes, an instrument still carrying his name today. Eos, goddess of the dawn, carried her own quietly sad story. She fell in love with a mortal man named Tithonus and asked Zeus to grant him immortality. A wish Zeus granted exactly as worded. Without the eternal youth, Eos had simply forgotten to request alongside it. Tithonus lived forever, but continued aging regardless, shrinking and withering with the passing centuries, until Eos, unable to bear watching him decline further, was said to have finally transformed him into a cicada, a creature whose endless, papery chirping the Greeks imagined as the sound of a voice that could no longer stop talking even long after the body attached to it had worn away. Selene, goddess of the moon and distinct in the earliest sources from Artemis, though later tradition increasingly blended the two together, loved a mortal shepherd named Endymion, and rather than watch him age and die as Eos had watched Tithonus, she asked Zeus to grant him eternal sleep instead, preserving his youth and beauty perfectly while she visited him each night, a much gentler resolution to the same basic problem of loving someone whose mortal life would otherwise run out too quickly. Proteus, an old sea god serving under Poseidon, already met earlier through the word protean, could answer any question truthfully, but only if caught and held firmly while shifting rapidly through a whole sequence of different shapes: lions, serpents, water, fire, refusing to settle into one form long enough to be questioned, unless his captors simply refused to let go no matter what he became. The Erinyes, or Furies, born from the blood of Uranus after his defeat by his own son generations earlier, pursued and tormented those guilty of especially grave crimes, above all, crimes committed against one's own family, most famously chasing Orestes relentlessly after his killing of his mother Clytemnestra in the house of Atreus story already told. Three sisters known as the Moirai, or Fates, controlled the length and shape of every mortal life through a single shared continuous act of weaving. Clotho spun the thread of a life, Lachesis measured out how long it would run, and Atropos cut it at the appointed moment of death, a task so fundamental to the structure of existence that even Zeus was generally described as unable to override their decisions once made. one of the few forces in the entire tradition consistently portrayed as operating beyond the reach of the king of the gods himself. A separate trio, the Charities, or Graces, associated with charm, beauty, and creativity, often appeared as attendants to Aphrodite, embodying a gentler, more decorative counterpart to the Fates' quiet and absolute authority over how long each life actually lasted. Another small group of sister goddesses, the Horai, governed the seasons and the passage of time more generally. And beyond their role marking the turning of the year, they were said to serve as gatekeepers of Olympus itself, responsible for opening and closing the heavy bank of clouds that separated the god's home from the sky below whenever a god needed to pass through. A quiet, almost domestic duty, tucked in among the far grander responsibilities carried by so many of their fellow minor deities. Many of Greek mythology's most famous monsters share a family connection that gets lost once their individual stories are told separately, since a large number of them descend from a single pair of primordial sea beings, Phorcys and Ceto. Their children included the three Gorgon sisters, of whom Medusa was the only mortal one, which is precisely why a hero was sent after her rather than her two immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale. Her gaze turned any living creature to stone, and even after her death, her severed head kept that power, eventually mounted on Athena's own shield as a lasting protective emblem. That image, wide-eyed with snakes for hair, went on to appear across Greek shields, coins, and doorways for centuries as a symbol believed to ward off evil by presenting a frightening face to anything approaching. A tradition echoed much later in the fashion world's own use of the same image as a logo. The Hydra, a serpent whose heads grew back too for every one removed unless the wound was sealed immediately, tested a hero's patience more than his strength. The Chimera combined a lion's body, a goat's head rising from its back, and a serpent for a tail. An unusual combination that gave English the modern word chimera, now used for any wildly implausible mixture. Cerberus, the three-headed hound guarding the Underworld's gates, was said to be a sibling of the Hydra, both children of the monstrous Echidna and the equally monstrous Typhon, tying an entire branch of mythology's most dangerous creatures into one tightly connected family. Typhon himself was Gaia's final and most powerful challenge to Zeus's rule, described as so enormous. His head brushed the stars, with 100 serpent heads producing sounds ranging from the voices of gods to the roars of bulls and lions. His clash with Zeus was close enough that some ancient sources describe Typhon briefly gaining the advantage before Zeus, restored with help from allies, finally won and buried him beneath Mount Etna, an explanation the ancient Greeks used to account for the mountain's ongoing volcanic rumblings. A separate, overlapping tradition credited the same rumblings to a defeated giant, born from Gaia during an earlier war against the Olympians that required a mortal hero's direct help to win, since divine power alone was said to be insufficient against that particular enemy. The Sphinx, guarding the approach to Thebes, combined a lion's body with a woman's face and, in most Greek depictions, a pair of wings, distinct from the wingless, male-faced sphinxes of Egyptian art that likely influenced the Greek imagination through centuries of trade and contact. She posed a single riddle to travelers, asking what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening, and only one traveler ever answered correctly. A human being, crawling in infancy, walking upright through adulthood, and leaning on a cane in old age. The Minotaur, kept within a labyrinth built specifically to contain him, was not cursed into monstrous form himself, but born that way, the consequence of a divine punishment aimed at his stepfather rather than at him, leaving him something closer to an unwilling casualty than a villain in his own right. The Sirens, whose song lured sailors toward danger, were often shown in earlier Greek art, not as the alluring half-fish women of later folklore, but as bird women, closer to harpies in form, a visual detail that shifted a great deal across the centuries as later artists reimagined them. Scylla, fixed permanently to a cliffside opposite the whirlpool Charybdis, had originally been a beautiful nymph before jealousy, and a rival's magic changed her shape. One more example of a female figure bearing the physical consequences of a conflict that was never really her own doing. The Harpies, mentioned just now for their resemblance to the earlier Sirens, were themselves winged spirits with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, sent as punishment against the blind prophet named Phineus, swooping down to steal or foul his food every time he tried to eat, until the winged sons of the north wind, traveling with Jason's crew of Argonauts, finally chased them off and won the grateful Phineus's help in return. Argus, already mentioned briefly through Hera's peacock, deserves a fuller introduction of his own. Called Argus Panoptes, meaning all-seeing, he was a giant covered in 100 eyes, arranged so that some always stayed open, and watchful even while others closed to rest, making him an ideal guard for Hera, who set him to watch over a nymph named Io after Zeus had transformed her into a cow to hide his own involvement with her from his wife. Hermes eventually lulled every one of Argus's 100 eyes to sleep with music and quiet conversation. And once the giant was fully asleep, Hera, grieving his loss, gathered his 100 eyes and placed them into the tail of her sacred peacock, which is why the bird still carries that pattern today. Many of the individual monsters already introduced share one further connection worth pointing out on its own. Echidna, mother of the Hydra and Cerberus alongside Typhon, was given the fitting title Mother of All Monsters by ancient writers, since her children, by various other unions as well, extended to the Chimera and the Sphinx, making her something close to a single common ancestor sitting behind nearly every major monster in the wider tradition. Beyond her direct offspring, Greek folklore also populated the night with smaller, more localized threats. Lamia, a figure said to prey specifically on children, and Empusa, a shape-shifting spirit capable of appearing as a beautiful woman before revealing one leg made of bronze and the other of a donkey, both used by Greek parents across the centuries in much the same practical way. Many other cultures have used their own cautionary figures, less as fully developed characters in their own right than as a way of keeping children close to home once darkness fell. Perseus, son of Zeus and the mortal princess Danae, was sent to retrieve Medusa's head using a set of borrowed divine equipment that reads almost like a checklist, a reflective bronze shield from Athena, so he could view her reflection rather than her direct gaze, winged sandals from Hermes for swift travel, and a helm of invisibility borrowed from Hades. From Medusa's severed neck sprang not one but two beings at once, the winged horse, Pegasus, and a warrior named Chrysaor, both conceived earlier with Poseidon and released only at that moment. A fact that surprises people who picture Pegasus springing from nothing more dramatic than clouds or sea foam. Perseus later rescued a princess named Andromeda from a sea monster, and, in a twist, the old prophecy had predicted despite every precaution taken against it, eventually caused his own grandfather's death by accident during an athletic competition many years afterward. Heracles remains the most celebrated hero in the entire tradition, and his 12 labors began not from pure ambition, but as an act of penance, assigned to him by the oracle at Delphi after Hera, who had opposed him from infancy, drove him to a period of madness during which he lost his own family. The labors that followed carried him across the known world and beyond it, wrestling the Nemean lion barehanded, ending the regenerating Hydra with fire and patience, capturing a bronze-hoofed deer sacred to Artemis after chasing it for an entire year, capturing an enormous wild boar alive from the slopes of Mount Erymanthos, and diverting 2 rivers to clean the Augean stables in a single day. A solution so clever that King Eurystheus initially refused to count it, arguing that using rivers rather than direct labor amounted to cheating. He drove off a flock of vicious metal-feathered birds terrorizing a lake near Stymphalos, captured a wild bull from Crete, the same bull connected to the Minotaur's own unusual origin already described earlier, and later released on the mainland near Marathon, where Theseus would eventually capture it a second time on his own path toward Athens, and travel to the far western edge of the world to retrieve the cattle of a monstrous 3-bodied herdsman named Geryon, a journey that gave rise to the pair of great rock formations flanking the entrance to the Mediterranean, still known in some traditions today as the Pillars of Heracles, recognized now as the Rock of Gibraltar and Jebel Musa. For his 11th labor, Heracles briefly relieved the Titan Atlas of the weight of the sky in exchange for a set of golden apples, then cleverly declined to take the burden back once Atlas tried to leave it with him permanently. For his 12th and final labor, he descended to the Underworld itself and returned with Cerberus, the only being ever recorded managing that particular round trip. Heracles' own death came through a bitter irony, a poisoned garment sent unknowingly by his own wife, who had been deceived into believing it carried a love charm rather than a lethal poison. And his suffering ended only once his mortal portion was consumed on a funeral pyre, allowing him to rise to Olympus as one of the very few figures in the entire tradition to complete the full transition from mortal to god. Theseus, credited with unifying the communities around Athens into a single city, is best remembered for finding his way out of the labyrinth using nothing more elaborate than a ball of thread given to him by the Cretan princess Ariadne so he could retrace his own steps once the Minotaur was defeated. Before any of that, on his very first journey to Athens as a young man, Theseus chose the more dangerous overland route specifically to test himself against a string of bandits and villains along the way, among them Procrustes, who forced travelers to lie down on an iron bed and fit it exactly, stretching those too short to fill it and cutting down those too tall, a punishment. Theseus turned back on Procrustes himself once. He reached him, and whose name survives today in the word Procrustean, still used for any standard or system that forces everything to fit a rigid, one-size mold regardless of the cost. His story carries a harder edge as well. He later abandoned Ariadne on the island of Naxos during the journey home, and in his grief and distraction afterward forgot to change his ship's sails from black to white as a signal of his survival, a mistake that led his own father to believe him dead and, in despair, to end his own life. Jason assembled a crew of heroes, the Argonauts, for his quest to recover the Golden Fleece, a voyage that in most tellings included Heracles for part of the journey, the musician Orpheus, whose songs could calm violent seas, and, according to several, though not all ancient sources, the huntress Atalanta, one of the few women recorded joining a major heroic expedition as a full member of the crew rather than as a prize or obstacle. Jason succeeded only with help from Medea, a Colchian princess skilled in magic who fell in love with him and later followed him back to Greece, a partnership that began in genuine triumph and would curdle years later into one of the darkest turns in the whole tradition. Bellerophon tamed the winged horse. Pegasus, with a golden bridle gifted by Athena, and used the horse to defeat the Chimera from the air, a victory that gave him enough confidence to attempt flying all the way to Olympus itself, seeking to join the company of the gods despite being only mortal. Zeus's response was a small gadfly sent to sting Pegasus and throw its rider from the sky, a minor irritant undoing an overreach of enormous scale, and Bellerophon survived the fall only to spend the rest of his life alone. A steep reminder that later writers frequently invoked as a caution against forgetting the line between mortal achievement and divine privilege. Oedipus offers Greek mythology's clearest illustration of a prophecy that cannot be outrun through avoidance, a pattern already noted in the section on fate and oracles. Warned before his birth that their son would grow up to bring great harm to his own family, his parents had him left exposed on a mountainside as an infant, only for him to be found, raised elsewhere, and grown to adulthood entirely unaware of his own true parentage. As a young man, Oedipus encountered a monstrous sphinx blocking the road to the city of Thebes, already introduced earlier for the riddle she posed to every traveler who approached, and where every previous traveler had failed and paid with his life. Oedipus alone answered correctly, freeing the city from her threat and earning a grateful welcome that eventually led, through a long chain of circumstances neither he nor his birth family could see coming, to a fate matching the very prophecy his parents had tried so hard to prevent by giving him away in the first place. Oedipus's later years were shadowed by grief once the truth finally came to light, and his loyal daughter Antigone accompanied him afterward through a long exile, later choosing, in her own separate and equally well-known story, family loyalty and her sense of what she considered a higher, unwritten law over obedience to a king's decree. A choice that cost her own life, but that centuries of later readers, philosophers and playwrights have continued returning to as an early and enduring symbol of principled resistance to unjust authority. Oedipus's two sons carried the family's troubles forward into the next generation. Eteocles and Polynices had agreed to share the throne of Thebes by alternating years of rule, but Eteocles refused to step aside once his turn ended, and Polynices, denied what he saw as his rightful claim, gathered an army of allied champions, remembered afterward as the Seven against Thebes, and marched on his own home city to take the throne by force. The two brothers ultimately brought about each other's downfall during the fighting that followed, a tragedy Hesiod himself considered significant enough to rank alongside the Trojan War as one of the two defining conflicts of the entire heroic age. Atalanta, raised by hunters after being abandoned as an infant, agreed to marry only a suitor who could beat her in a foot race, a challenge she won again and again until Hippomenes, given 3 golden apples by Aphrodite, one by dropping them one at a time to distract her during the race, securing her hand through cleverness rather than speed. Before that race, Atalanta had already made a name for herself in another famous hunt. When a wild boar sent by an offended Artemis began ravaging the countryside around Calydon, a local prince named Meleager gathered a large party of heroes to bring it down, Atalanta among them. And though several of the men present resisted hunting alongside a woman, it was Atalanta who drew first blood, wounding the boar before Meleager delivered the final blow. Meleager, impressed and increasingly fond of her, awarded Atalanta the boar's hide as her prize over the objections of his own uncles, a decision that set off a family quarrel with consequences far more serious than a disputed trophy usually carries, since Meleager's own life, according to a prophecy delivered at his birth, was mystically tied to a log burning in his mother's hearth, and the dispute eventually led his mother, in grief and anger over her brother's deaths and the resulting quarrel, to throw that same log onto the fire, ending her son's life the moment it finished burning. Transformation runs through an unusually large share of Greek mythology, so much so that the Roman poet Ovid built an entire long poem, the Metamorphoses, around collecting these stories together. A nymph named Daphne, pursued by an infatuated Apollo, prayed to her father, a river god, for rescue as he closed in on her, and her prayer was answered with transformation into a laurel tree, her skin becoming bark and her hair becoming leaves. Apollo afterward wore laurel leaves as a symbol of the admiration he could no longer express to her directly, a tradition that eventually gave rise to the laurel wreaths awarded to poets and victors across much of later Western culture. Arachne, a weaver confident enough in her own skill to challenge Athena directly to a contest, produced work the goddess could find no honest fault with, and it was the content of Arachne's tapestry, an unflattering portrait of the god's own behavior, that provoked Athena's anger more than any flaw in the craftsmanship. Athena destroyed the work and, in a punishment that still carried its own strange mercy, transformed the despairing weaver into a spider rather than letting her die, condemning her and all her descendants to spin thread on a far smaller scale for the rest of time. Actaeon, a hunter who happened upon Artemis bathing in a forest pool, was transformed into a stag by the goddess and no longer recognized by his own hunting dogs, who turned on him instead. Callisto, pursued by Zeus in disguise and later punished by both Artemis and Hera, despite having little control over what had happened to her, was transformed into a bear and eventually placed among the stars alongside her own son, a story this account will return to shortly. Io, already met earlier through Argus and his 100 eyes, continued suffering even after her guard was lulled to sleep, since Hera, still certain of Zeus's involvement, sent a biting gadfly to torment the transformed nymph and drive her, in the form of a cow, across a huge stretch of the ancient world, wandering in pain from region to region until she eventually reached Egypt, where Zeus finally restored her to human form, and where, according to some later traditions, she was worshipped afterward under a new identity connected to Egyptian religion. A gentler transformation belongs to Alcyone and her husband Ceyx, a devoted couple separated when Ceyx drowned at sea during a voyage Alcyone had begged him not to take. Alcyone's grief was so complete that the gods, moved by her devotion, transformed both of them into kingfishers, and Greek belief held that the halcyon, another name for the kingfisher, calmed the winter seas each year just long enough to nest and raise her young in peace. A period of about 2 weeks of unusually still winter weather that the ancient world came to call the halcyon days. a phrase that has drifted in modern English into meaning any calm, contented stretch of time. Its origin in a story about grief, answered with unexpected gentleness, largely forgotten along the way. Not every transformation ended in loss. Pygmalion, a sculptor who fell in love with an ivory statue of his own making, prayed to Aphrodite for a bride resembling his creation, and the goddess, moved by his sincerity, brought the statue to life beneath his hands. King Midas, granted a wish by Dionysus, asked that everything he touched turn to gold, a gift that curdled almost immediately once his food and drink turned to inedible metal, forcing him back to Dionysus to beg for its reversal, a favor granted by having Midas wash in a particular river, said afterward to carry traces of gold in its sands, and an elderly couple, Baucis and Philemon, who offered simple hospitality to Zeus and Hermes, traveling in disguise as ordinary, weary strangers, were rewarded for their kindness with long, contented lives, and, at the end of them, transformation together into a pair of trees growing from a single trunk, granted their own request never to be separated even in death. A mortal named Phaethon, son of the sun god Helios, begged to drive his father's chariot across the sky for a single day and lost control of it, forcing Zeus to bring the runaway chariot down before it could scorch the world further. Phaethon's grieving sisters wept so long at the sight of his fall that they were transformed into poplar trees, their tears hardening into amber, giving the ancient Greeks a mythological explanation for a real, valuable material that traders carried along genuine routes stretching as far as the Baltic coast. A child born to Hermes and Aphrodite, carrying both parents' names combined as Hermaphroditus, attracted the attention of a water nymph while bathing. And when he rejected her, she prayed that the two of them might never be separated, a wish granted in an unusually literal way when their two bodies merged into one. The word hermaphrodite, used for centuries afterward in biology and medicine, traces directly back to this single transformation. And the curse could travel through an entire family line rather than settling on just one person. Tantalus, already introduced through the word he lent to modern language, had a son named Pelops, restored to life by the gods after his father's terrible offense against them, and Pelops's own descendants carried the family's troubles forward for generations. His sons Atreus and Thyestes locked into a bitter and escalating rivalry, and their line continuing through Atreus' son Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy, whose own death at his wife's hands and the vengeance that followed from their son Orestes gave Athenian tragedy some of its richest material, most memorably in Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia. Ancient audiences read the resolution of that trilogy, Orestes' eventual trial before a court in Athens, rather than further private vengeance, as marking a symbolic shift from one generation avenging the last toward a newer system of justice handled by courts rather than grieving relatives. The Greek underworld carried a geography as detailed as any region of the living world, built around several named rivers, each with its own meaning. The Styx was sacred enough that even the gods swore their most binding oaths upon it, oaths that could not be broken once made without severe consequence, a rule that occasionally trapped Zeus himself into promises he came to regret. The Lethe carried forgetting in its current, and the dead were ferried across by an old boatman named Charon, who required a single coin as payment, a belief that shaped real burial customs among many ancient Greek communities, who placed coins with their dead to help ensure safe passage. It is worth noting that archaeologists have found this practice widely, but not everywhere, and its popularity varied by region and period rather than holding as a single fixed rule across the whole Greek world. Proper burial mattered enormously beyond the coin itself, since the unburied dead were believed to wander the near shore for 100 years before Charon would finally agree to carry them across, a belief that gave real weight to the formal mourning rituals, processions, and set periods of grief observed by ancient Greek families. Practices carried out not simply out of sorrow, but out of genuine concern for a loved one's safe passage into the next stage of their existence. Guarding the gates stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound Heracles once managed to subdue for his final labor, allowing spirits in freely but permitting almost none back out. Once inside, souls came before three judges renowned for their fairness during their own lives, and most ordinary people were sent on to the Asphodel Meadows, a vast, pale, and largely neutral expanse, neither reward nor punishment, simply a continuation. Those judged especially virtuous or connected to the gods by blood went instead to Elysium, a place of comfort later. Tradition sometimes merged with the Isles of the Blessed, a paradise reserved originally for the generation of heroes who fought at Troy and Thebes. Tartarus held the underworld's more severe punishments, and several of them entered everyday language on their own terms. Tantalus, already met through his name's journey into English, stood there surrounded by food and water he could never quite reach. Sisyphus, a former king remembered for his cleverness and for twice managing to slip past death itself before finally being caught for good, was condemned to push a boulder endlessly up a hill, watching it roll back down each time he neared the top, and his name gave English the adjective Sisyphean, still used for any task that seems pointless and never-ending. Ixion, who'd abused the hospitality shown to him by the gods, was bound to a wheel spinning endlessly through the sky, and the 50 Danaids, who had wronged their own husbands on their wedding night, were set to carry water forever in jars riddled with holes. Each punishment echoed the shape of the original offense. Hospitality abused answered with permanent want. Betrayal answered with permanently pointless labor. One gentler thread runs alongside all this severity. Cronus, defeated by his own son generations earlier, was said in some later traditions to have eventually been released from his imprisonment to preside peacefully over the Isles of the Blessed. A quiet, almost forgiving footnote to a story that had begun with such violence. Elysium's name has traveled a long way from its original mythological setting, the grand Paris avenue known as the Champs. Élysées takes its own name directly from the same Elysian fields described here. A Renaissance-era naming choice that borrowed the idea of a paradise reserved for the fortunate dead and applied it to one of the most fashionable streets in an entirely different city. More than 2,000 years after the underworld geography that first inspired it took shape. The underworld's most famous visitor from the world of the living was a musician named Orpheus, whose skill on the lyre was said to be powerful enough to charm wild animals and calm even the most turbulent natural forces. When his wife Eurydice died from a snake's bite shortly after their wedding, Orpheus traveled down into the underworld itself, using his music to move Charon and Cerberus past their usual resistance, and his playing moved even Hades and Persephone, who agreed to release Eurydice on one condition: Orpheus had to lead her out without looking back at her until they had both fully returned to daylight. He led the way, Eurydice following in silence behind him. And just short of the threshold, doubt overcame him, and he turned to look. Eurydice was pulled back a second time, and this time the loss held for good. A small failure of trust that cost Orpheus everything and left him grieving for the rest of his own life. Prophecy occupied an unusually central place in Greek mythology, and its most famous source, the oracle at Delphi, was a real physical location. Ancient Greeks from across the Mediterranean actually traveled to consult, not a setting invented purely for storytelling. The oracle was staffed by a priestess called a Pythia, a title connected to Python, a serpent said to have guarded the site before Apollo claimed it as his own. Ancient sources describe the Pythia entering a trance before speaking, and some modern geologists have connected this to gases that may have seeped up through a fissure in the rock beneath the temple. Though this explanation remains debated rather than settled among historians and scientists alike. Beyond Delphi, the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, where priests were said to interpret the rustling of a sacred oak, ranked among the oldest oracular sites in the Greek world, with some ancient sources considering it even older than Delphi itself. Delphic prophecies had a well-earned reputation for ambiguity, technically coming true, but rarely in the way the person asking had expected. A real historical king, Croesus of Lydia, was told that if he went to war with Persia, he would destroy a great empire, and he proceeded confidently, only discovering after his defeat that the empire the prophecy meant was his own. This pattern runs through the mythical stories as well, and it follows a consistent internal logic. Prophecies in this tradition are almost never avoided through clever evasion, and the very attempt to escape one typically becomes the mechanism that fulfills it instead. Cassandra, a Trojan princess, was granted the gift of true prophecy by Apollo, who had hoped it would win her affection. When she declined him despite accepting the gift, he added a condition he could not otherwise revoke. No one would ever believe her, no matter how urgently or accurately she spoke. She foresaw the fall of her own city and was, as always, disbelieved. A fate later writers have returned to repeatedly as an image for the particular difficulty of being right and dismissed at the same moment. Tiresias, a blind prophet who appears at key moments across several major myths, carried an origin story, unusual even within a tradition full of transformation. Having briefly lived as a woman after an encounter with two mating snakes, and having lived as a man both before and after, he was called on by Zeus and Hera to settle a private dispute, and his honest answer cost him his sight, but earned him prophecy and long life in compensation. A trade Zeus offered because a god cannot undo what another god has already done. Not every gift of prophecy came through Delphi or through a formal oracle at all. Melampus, a legendary seer, gained his own ability after caring for a pair of orphan snakes as a boy, who later repaid him by licking his ears clean while he slept, granting him the power to understand the speech of animals, a gift he used afterward to interpret omens from birds and other creatures, rather than relying on any temple or priestess. Ordinary Greek divination took many other everyday forms as well, including augury, reading the flight patterns of birds for meaning, and the interpretation of dreams, both practiced widely enough that they appear constantly across Greek literature as background detail rather than anything unusual, a routine part of how many ancient Greeks tried to make sense of an uncertain future. A stranger and more unsettling oracle operated at a site sacred to a hero named Trophonius, where visitors seeking answers had to descend into a narrow underground chamber to consult him directly, rather than receiving their prophecy through any priestess acting as an intermediary. Ancient writers describe those who emerged from the experience as shaken and unable to smile for some time afterward, an effect serious enough that a Greek expression for someone unusually grim or humorless translates roughly to having consulted the oracle of Trophonius, a small linguistic trace of just how deeply unsettling that particular pilgrimage was understood to be. The mortal king, that same sea nymph, Thetis, eventually married, had to earn her hand through unusual persistence rather than any ordinary courtship. Peleus was warned that Thetis, like the sea god Proteus already introduced earlier, could shift through a whole sequence of different forms: fire, water, a lion, a serpent, whenever anyone tried to hold her against her will, and he was advised to seize her regardless and simply refuse to let go no matter what shape she took. Peleus followed that advice, holding on through every transformation. Thetis attempted until she finally relented and agreed to the marriage, a wedding significant enough on its own to draw every god in existence as a guest, which is precisely what made Eris's exclusion from the celebration sting sharply enough to set the rest of this next story in motion. The Trojan War, the largest conflict in the entire body of Greek myth, traces its origin back to a wedding invitation that was never sent. Eris, goddess of strife, was deliberately excluded from the marriage of the sea nymph Thetis to a mortal king, and in retaliation she tossed a golden apple into the gathering, inscribed with words claiming it belonged to the fairest goddess present. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed it, and the dispute was handed to a mortal judge, the Trojan prince Paris, who chose Aphrodite's bribe, the love of the most beautiful woman alive, over Hera's offer of power and Athena's offer of wisdom in battle. That woman was Helen, already married to a Greek king, and her arrival in Troy with Paris, whether through persuasion or outright abduction depending on the telling, gave Agamemnon, brother of the wronged husband, grounds to assemble a massive coalition of Greek forces. Before that fleet could even set sail, it faced an unexpected delay. The winds at the harbor of Aulis refused to cooperate, and a seer eventually revealed that Agamemnon had offended Artemis and could only secure favorable winds by sacrificing his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon went through with it, a decision that secured the fleet's departure for Troy, but that his wife Clytemnestra never forgave. An old grievance she carried silently for the entire decade of the war, and finally acted on the moment her husband returned home victorious. Already touched on earlier through the wider curse running across his family line. Homer's own account of the war, the Iliad, is worth pausing on for a moment, because it covers far less ground than most people assume. The poem opens 9 years into the siege and closes with the funeral of the Trojan prince Hector, ending before the city actually falls. Its true subject is not the war itself, but the anger of Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, after Agamemnon claims a war prize that had been awarded to him, an insult that drives Achilles to withdraw from the fighting until the death of his closest companion, Patroclus, at Hector's hands, draws him back in with a fury that overshadows everything before it. Achilles kills Hector in single combat, and the poem's final, quieter scene shows Hector's grieving father slipping into the Greek camp under cover of night to beg for his son's body back, a request Achilles grants. The Iliad includes one especially unusual episode worth knowing on its own. A Greek warrior named Diomedes, fighting with divine assistance from Athena, actually wounded two gods directly on the battlefield, striking Aphrodite in the hand as she tried to shield her son, and later wounding Ares himself, sending the war god fleeing back to Olympus in pain. A rare and striking reminder that even the gods, in Homer's version of the war, were not entirely beyond the reach of a mortal spear under the right circumstances. Not every hero central to Troy's eventual fall appears prominently in the Iliad itself. Philoctetes, a Greek archer who carried the legendary bow of Heracles, was abandoned on a deserted island early in the expedition after suffering a wound that would not heal, only for the Greeks to learn, years later, that Troy could not be taken without his bow, forcing an awkward and reluctant retrieval mission back to the island he had been left on. And Laocoon, a Trojan priest, is remembered for warning his fellow citizens against bringing the wooden horse inside their walls. A warning dismissed just as thoroughly as Cassandra's had been. And later, Roman tradition added a dramatic postscript describing Laocoon and his sons attacked by serpents sent from the sea shortly afterward, an image later immortalized in one of antiquity's most famous surviving sculptures. According to the wider epic cycle tradition, Troy's safety was also believed to depend on a smaller, more physical object, the Palladium, an ancient wooden statue of Athena said to have fallen from the sky and to guarantee the city's protection for as long as it remained within the walls. Odysseus and Diomedes are said to have slipped into Troy together before the final assault, specifically to steal it. A quiet act of theft that receives far less attention today than the dramatic image of the wooden horse, but that ancient audiences treated as an equally necessary step toward the city's eventual fall. The Iliad also pauses, in one of its most admired passages, to describe in detail a new shield forged for Achilles by Hephaestus himself after his original armor was lost, decorated not with scenes of battle, but with an entire miniature world, weddings, harvests, courtroom disputes, dancing, and the ordinary rhythms of daily life. A deliberate contrast set against the poem's relentless focus on war, as if the god of the forge wanted to remind the greatest warrior at Troy of everything continuing to exist peacefully beyond the battlefield he was about to return to. Ajax, remembered as the largest and physically strongest of the Greek warriors at Troy, faced his own quieter tragedy after Achilles' death, when his armor, widely regarded as the finest ever made, was awarded instead to Odysseus following a formal dispute judged by the assembled Greek leaders. Ajax's inability to accept this decision led to a period of shame and declining judgment that Sophocles later built an entire surviving tragedy around. A story handled with real sympathy for a warrior whose considerable strength offered him no defense at all against a wound to his own pride. Achilles' own death, along with the fall of Troy itself, comes not from Homer, but from later poems and summaries collectively called the epic cycle, most of which survive only in fragments today. According to that broader tradition, Achilles was eventually killed by an arrow guided to his one vulnerable heel, already flagged earlier as a later addition rather than something Homer himself describes. The famous wooden horse, filled with hidden soldiers and left outside the gates as a supposed peace offering, likewise comes from this later material rather than the Iliad, meaning one of the most iconic images connected to the entire war was never actually described in detail by Homer at all. Cassandra, already introduced for her curse of unbelieved prophecy, warned specifically against bringing that horse inside the walls, and was ignored, as always, right up until the city burned around her. Troy fell, and its survivors scattered into their own separate stories. Agamemnon's household already covered through the wider curse on his family line, and a Trojan prince named Aeneas, who escaped the burning city and whose own long journey westward became, in Roman rather than Greek tradition, the foundation myth connecting Rome's origins back to Troy. Odysseus' own return took the longest of all, an additional 10 years chronicled in the Odyssey. He blinded a Cyclops named Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon, drawing the sea god's lasting hostility after making the mistake of shouting his real name back at the blinded giant while sailing away. A piece of pride that gave Polyphemus exactly what he needed to call down his father's curse by name. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, gave Odysseus a leather bag containing every unfavorable wind sealed safely inside, leaving only a gentle breeze free to carry the ship home. And Ithaca was almost within sight when Odysseus's own curious crew, suspecting the sealed bag held hidden treasure, opened it while he slept, releasing every stormy wind at once and blowing the ship all the way back to where it had started. He resisted the witch Circe's magic with an herb given by Hermes, listened to the Sirens' song safely bound to his own mast, and lost several of his crew navigating between the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis. After his men violated a divine prohibition, and Zeus destroyed their ship in response, Odysseus alone reached the shore of the nymph Calypso, who kept him for 7 years before the gods finally intervened. He arrived home to find his household overrun by suitors pressing his wife Penelope to remarry. And Penelope had held them off for years with a trick of her own, promising to choose once she finished weaving a burial shroud while secretly unraveling each night's progress. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus revealed himself at the right moment, and with his son's help, restored order to his own home after 20 years away. A handful of smaller facts round out the picture of the war itself. The Iliad's catalogue of ships lists something close to 1,200 vessels sailing for Troy, a number scholars still debate as either a genuine reflection of how ancient audiences imagined the war's scale or a later poetic expansion. After the death of Patroclus, the Greeks paused the war itself to hold an elaborate set of funeral games in his honor, including chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, and archery, a reminder of how deeply competitive athletic contest was woven into Greek culture even in the middle of an active war. Treated as a natural and fitting way to honor a fallen companion alongside more solemn funeral rites. Achilles himself is said to have known, through prophecy delivered by his own mother, that he faced a stark choice between a long, peaceful, but ultimately unremarkable life spent far from Troy, and a short life bringing him lasting glory. Kleos in the original Greek, a concept the Iliad treats as close to the highest achievement available to a mortal warrior. A kind of immortality secured not by actually living forever, but by being remembered and sung about by later generations. Achilles' decision to fight and die young rather than return home forgotten sits close to the emotional center of the entire poem, expressing a value system that placed lasting reputation above the simple length of a life. And Helen's own culpability was never agreed upon. Even in antiquity, Homer treats her with real sympathy, showing her lamenting the destruction her presence caused, while a separate tradition associated with the poet Stesichorus claimed she never went to Troy at all, spending the war safely in Egypt while the gods sent only a phantom double made of cloud in her place. An alternate version. The playwright Euripides later built an entire surviving tragedy around. Some of Greek mythology's best facts live in its stranger corners, away from the major wars and quests. Prometheus, a titan who had refused to fight against Zeus, was credited in one strand of tradition with shaping the first humans directly out of clay and water, and in a separate strand, with a smaller but equally important act, stealing fire from the gods and carrying it down to earth, hidden inside a hollow fennel stalk after humanity had been left without it. Zeus punished him by chaining him to a remote mountain, where an eagle returned each day to trouble him, a torment that lasted many generations, until Heracles, already mentioned freeing him during his own travels, finally put an end to it. Zeus's punishment extended to humanity as well, in the form of the first woman, Pandora, sent down carrying a sealed jar she had been told never to open. She opened it anyway, and every hardship that troubles human life came pouring out, though she managed to close the lid before everything escaped, leaving one thing trapped inside, generally understood as hope, though the original Greek leaves real room to read. Even hope as one more affliction rather than a comfort. A genuine ambiguity classicists still debate today. Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, played his own quiet role in this same story. He had already exhausted every useful trait while equipping the animals of the world, which is why humans were left without claws or fur in the first place, and he later accepted Pandora as a bride, despite his brother's direct warning never to accept any gift sent by Zeus, a tidy illustration for ancient audiences, of forethought and afterthought bound together as brothers. The cornucopia, the overflowing horn of plenty still used today in harvest imagery, traces back to a goat named Amalthea who nursed the infant Zeus in hiding on Crete. He accidentally broke off one of her horns while playing, and rather than leaving the accident unaddressed, blessed the broken horn with the power to endlessly produce whatever its owner desired. Hesiod also described 5 successive ages of man: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron, each harsher than the one before it. The Golden Age offering food without labor and death without fear. The Iron Age, the one Hesiod believed he himself was living through, marked instead by constant hard work and a growing distance between mortals and gods. This same shape, a golden beginning slowly giving way to a harder present, turns up across a wide range of unrelated ancient cultures, suggesting the impulse to imagine an idealized past may be something many different societies have reached for independently. A different kind of strange detail belongs to Eros and Psyche, a story closer to a fairy tale than most Greek myths, and one that survives mainly through a later Roman retelling rather than an early Greek source, though its central figures are Greek at their root. Psyche, a mortal woman so beautiful people neglected Aphrodite's own worship to admire her instead, drew the goddess's jealousy, and Aphrodite sent her son Eros to punish her, only for Eros to fall in love with Psyche himself. Their relationship was conducted entirely in darkness, with Psyche forbidden from ever looking at her husband directly, a condition she eventually broke, and her name, meaning soul or breath, has survived directly into the modern word psychology, an entire field of study named after a mortal woman's curiosity, longing, and eventual perseverance through a series of nearly impossible tasks. Ganymede, a Trojan prince famous for his uncommon beauty, was carried up to Olympus by Zeus, who took the form of an eagle to bring him there, and was made cupbearer to the gods, a position of real honor within the divine household. A craftsman named Daedalus, who had designed the labyrinth housing the Minotaur on Crete, later fell out of favor with King Minos and was confined on the island along with his young son Icarus to keep the labyrinth secret from spreading. Unable to escape by sea, Daedalus built 2 pairs of wings from feathers and wax, warning his son specifically not to fly too low, where sea spray would weigh the feathers down, and not too high, where the sun's heat would melt the wax holding them together. Icarus, caught up in the simple thrill of flight, climbed higher and higher despite the warning, and the sun softened his wings enough that he fell into the sea below, which still carries his name today. A small, human story about a father's warning going unheeded by a son, swept up in a feeling he had never experienced before that. A gentler cautionary tale belongs to a young man named Cyparissus, beloved by Apollo and devoted to a magnificent tame stag that had become his closest companion. During a hunt, Cyparissus accidentally struck and killed the stag with a javelin, and his grief afterward was so complete and so inconsolable that he asked the gods to let his mourning last forever. Apollo, unable to refuse him and unable to ease his sorrow any other way, transformed Cyparissus into a cypress tree, whose dark, slender, downward drooping branches have been associated with mourning and grief ever since, planted even today near graves and cemeteries across much of the Mediterranean world as a quiet, living echo of that original ancient sorrow. Looking back across everything gathered so far, a single pattern keeps resurfacing under different names in different stories. Icarus climbing too high on borrowed wings, Bellerophon attempting to ride Pegasus all the way to Olympus, Arachne refusing to defer to a goddess she had truly outmatched, Niobe boasting of her own fertility against Letos, Marsyas challenging Apollo despite having no real chance of winning. The Greeks had a specific word for this particular failure: hubris, a kind of excessive pride or overreach that assumed a person could act without limit or consequence. And it is worth noticing, gathering all these separate stories together, that the punishment rarely fell on simple ambition itself. Heracles, Perseus, and Jason all reached for enormous, difficult goals and were rewarded rather than punished for it. What consistently drew a response from the gods was the specific moment a mortal stopped acknowledging any limit at all, treating one great success as license to attempt something categorically beyond a human's proper place, a distinction the Greeks clearly considered worth returning to again and again across so many otherwise unrelated stories. The Golden Fleece itself, the object of Jason's entire quest, had its own smaller backstory rarely included in summaries of the voyage. It came from a magical ram sent by Hermes to rescue 2 children from a plot against their lives, one of whom fell during the flight and drowned in the strait that still carries her name, while the other completed the journey and, in gratitude, sacrificed the ram and hung its fleece, turned to gold, in a sacred grove guarded afterward by a sleepless dragon, meaning the treasure that launched an entire legendary voyage began as an act of rescue that had already, in its own smaller way, ended in loss. One of the tradition's funny episodes involves Aphrodite, her husband Hephaestus, and her lover Ares, Hephaestus. learning of the affair from the sun god Helios, who saw everything from the sky, crafted an impossibly fine net and rigged it above his own bed, catching the pair together and summoning the other gods to witness their embarrassment. A scene Homer describes as provoking real laughter among those gathered to watch rather than any deeper scandal. Not every contest against the gods ended so lightly. A satyr named Marsyas, having found a discarded flute once played by Athena, challenged Apollo to a musical contest and lost, and Apollo's punishment for the satyr's presumption in challenging him at all was severe enough that several surviving ancient artworks linger on the cruelty of the outcome rather than treating it as simple, deserved justice. The Muses themselves faced their own challenge from a group of mortal sisters who claimed to sing better than they did, a boast that ended with the sisters transformed into magpies, forced to chatter rather than sing, and even the Sirens once challenged the Muses to a contest and lost, their wings plucked afterward as punishment for their presumption, which helps explain why later tradition sometimes describes them as unable to fly. Two figures already introduced through the words they gave the English language, Narcissus and Echo, deserve their full story told together rather than separately, since their two fates were bound up in each other from the start. Echo, cursed by Hera to repeat only the last words spoken to her, fell in love with the beautiful young Narcissus and followed him silently through the forest, unable to speak first, able only to echo back fragments of whatever he said. When Narcissus, who had already rejected every admirer who approached him, discovered her and turned her away as coldly as the rest, Echo withdrew in heartbreak into a lonely cave until nothing remained of her but her voice, still repeating whatever it happens to hear. Narcissus's own reckoning came soon after, when he knelt beside a still forest pool and caught sight of his own reflection, mistaking it for a separate, impossibly beautiful stranger, and fell into a fascination with the image so complete that he could not bring himself to eat, drink, or leave the water's edge, wasting away there until a flower, which still carries his name, grew in the spot where he died. A fitting closing image for a story about a young man who never once managed to see past himself. Real Greek religious practice, separate from the grand narratives told about the gods, filled an entire calendar with festivals, sacrifices, and communal ritual. Animal sacrifice at an altar was routine rather than rare, with certain portions burned as an offering and the rest distributed among the human participants for a shared meal, turning worship into a practical occasion for communal feasting as much as a solemn rite. Libations, small offerings of wine, honey, or oil poured onto the ground, accompanied everyday moments as well as major festivals, common enough that literary works from the period show characters pausing to pour one before a meal or a journey as an unremarkable, almost automatic gesture. The city Dionysia, held annually in Athens in honor of Dionysus, became the occasion for the premiere of new tragedies and comedies, meaning many of the plays still studied today, including works retelling several of the very myths gathered here, were first performed not as literature in the modern sense, but as part of an actual religious festival, judged before an audience of thousands. The Panathenaea, held for Athena, included athletic and musical competition alongside a grand procession carrying a newly woven robe up to the Acropolis to dress an ancient statue of the goddess, a piece of civic ritual immortalized in stone on the frieze of the Parthenon itself. The ancient Olympic Games, the most famous of all these festivals, were held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus, beginning according to tradition around 776 BCE, a date the Greeks used as a fixed reference point for dating other events. Competitors traveled from across the Greek world, and a sacred truce was declared for the game's duration, allowing safe passage through territories that might otherwise have been at war. The games continued for well over 1,000 years before Roman authorities suspended them near the end of the 4th century CE. A run far longer than the modern revival has yet managed since its restart in 1896. The Eleusinian Mysteries connected the Demeter and Persephone's story of seasonal separation and reunion, represented one of the most significant and most closely guarded of all Greek religious practices. Drawing initiates from across the ancient world to the town of Eleusis for rites that promised some form of comfort regarding what might await them after death. The secrecy was maintained with real discipline for well over 1,000 years. And even now, scholars cannot say with confidence exactly what took place during the central ceremony, since participants who did take part consistently declined to describe it, treating their vow of silence as a fully binding obligation rather than a formality. Alongside official religion ran a quieter, more personal layer of practice. Curse tablets, small sheets of lead inscribed with a request that a god, often Hermes, Hecate, or a figure from the underworld, bring misfortune down on a named rival in love, business, or competition, have been recovered by archaeologists in the hundreds, offering a candid window into the everyday grievances of ordinary people that survives more directly than any grand mythological narrative. Belief in the evil eye, a harmful glance caused simply by envy, ran alongside these tablets, and protective amulets shaped like eyes, meant to reflect the harmful gaze back toward its source, remained common across the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. The temple at Delphi carried more than an oracle. Visitors arriving there passed inscriptions carved directly into the temple grounds, bearing short maxims meant as practical wisdom for daily life, the most famous being "Know thyself," alongside "Nothing in excess," both attributed by various ancient sources to different sages rather than to any single author, and both repeated so often in later Greek philosophy that they came to represent something close to a foundational statement of Greek ethical thought in miniature. Not every religious festival welcomed the whole community equally. The Thesmophoria, held in honor of Demeter, was celebrated exclusively by married women, who gathered for several days of rites connected to fertility and the harvest that men were strictly forbidden from witnessing. One of relatively few religious occasions in ancient Greek life organized entirely around and for women, standing in useful contrast to the more general festivals like the Panathenaea and City Dionysia that welcomed the wider public. Spring itself had its own dedicated celebration in Athens, the Anthesteria, held in honor of Dionysus and centered on the opening of that year's new wine, with the festival's very name connected to the Greek word for flowers, marking the same turning of the season already explained through Persephone's yearly return from the underworld. The Anthesteria carried an unusually mixed tone even by Greek standards, blending genuine festivity with a quieter, more solemn undercurrent, since the same days were also believed to be when the spirits of the dead moved freely through the city. And households were said to smear their doorframes with pitch and chew buckthorn leaves to keep any wandering spirits from slipping inside uninvited. Devotion to these gods also produced some of the largest and most celebrated monuments of the ancient world. A colossal bronze statue of Helios, the sun god, was erected at the harbor entrance of the island of Rhodes in the early 3rd century BCE, standing roughly as tall as the modern Statue of Liberty. And though it toppled in an earthquake only a few decades after its completion, it remained famous enough in antiquity to be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, remembered today as the Colossus of Rhodes. A second wonder from that same traditional list honored Zeus directly. A massive seated statue of the god at Olympia, carved by the sculptor Phidias from ivory and gold and housed inside a temple built specifically to contain it. So large that ancient visitors reportedly joked that if the god stood up, he would take the roof off his own temple with him. Hospitality, xenia in Greek, functioned as something close to a sacred law running quietly beneath dozens of individual myths, which helps explain why its violation appears again and again as a trigger for real consequences. Zeus himself carried the title Zeus Genios, protector of guests and strangers. Paris's taking of Helen was, on one level, a betrayal of the hospitality Menelaus had shown him as a guest in his own home. The suitors who overran Odysseus's household for years without any right to do so violated the same code, and their removal upon his return was framed by the poem less as simple revenge than as a restoration of proper order. And Baucis and Philemon, the elderly couple already met earlier, were rewarded specifically because they alone, among an entire region of households, extended proper welcome to travelers who turned out to be gods. The night sky became one of Greek mythology's favorite canvases, and a considerable number of constellations still visible today carry stories the Greeks attached to them long before modern astronomy gave the same patterns purely scientific names. Orion, one of the most recognizable constellations in the sky, commemorates a hunter of legendary skill, and the scorpion sometimes blamed for his death was placed in a separate part of the sky, specifically positioned so the two would never rise above the horizon at the same time, reflecting genuine, careful observation by ancient skywatchers of which patterns actually appear during which seasons. The Pleiades, a tight cluster of stars used across the ancient Mediterranean by farmers and sailors to mark the turning of the agricultural and sailing seasons, were explained as 7 sisters transformed first into doves and then into stars while fleeing Orion's pursuit. Placed near his own constellation, so the ancient sky preserved the memory of a chase that never quite reached its conclusion. Callisto and her son, already met earlier in their transformation into bears, became Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the great and little bears, permanently separated from the ordinary human world even as they were preserved together in the heavens. Cassiopeia, a vain queen whose boasting about her own beauty led to her daughter Andromeda being chained to a rock for a sea monster, was placed in the sky in a position that required her, by the ancient Greek understanding of the arrangement, to circle the pole hanging upside down for part of each night, her punishment continuing even after death. Perseus and Andromeda themselves both received constellations, positioned near each other as a lasting tribute to the myth's happier ending, along with the sea monster Cetus nearby. Pegasus became one of the larger and more recognizable constellations as well, its 4 brightest stars forming a distinctive square still used by skywatchers today as a reference point for locating other nearby patterns. Even the zodiac, the band of 12 constellations tracking the sun's apparent yearly path, carries figures drawn from myth. Taurus, connected by some traditions to the bull form Zeus took to carry off Europa, and Capricorn, linked to Pan, said to have transformed the lower half of his body into a fishtail while fleeing the same conflict that had once sent several Olympian gods fleeing to Egypt in animal disguise to escape the monster Typhon. A few more constellations round out the sky's own mythological catalogue. Draco, a long, winding constellation coiling near the pole, was said to represent the sleepless dragon that once guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, placed among the stars after Heracles' own encounter with that garden during his 11th labor. Corona Borealis, the northern crown, commemorates a smaller and gentler story, the jeweled crown Dionysus gave to Ariadne, the same Cretan princess who had once helped Theseus escape the Labyrinth, only to be left behind on Naxos. And Dionysus was said to have placed her crown among the stars as a lasting mark of his own devotion to her after their eventual marriage. And Libra, the scales, is connected in some traditions to Astraea, goddess of justice, who was said to have lived among humanity during the earlier, gentler ages of man, before finally withdrawing to the heavens as the world grew harsher, taking her scales with her. One more small echo of the same declining ages of man already described earlier. Beyond the dozen words already introduced at the very start, Greek mythology has left traces across an unusually wide range of modern vocabulary, science, and idiom, worth gathering together now that so many of the underlying stories have been told in full. The word mentor, used today for any trusted guide, comes from a specific character in the Odyssey, an old friend of Odysseus, whose form Athena repeatedly borrowed to advise the young Telemachus during his father's absence, meaning the original mentor in Western literature was, in the plainest sense, a disguised goddess offering wisdom under a borrowed name. Herculean, describing any task requiring immense effort, borrows the Roman form of Heracles' name. Mercurial, describing a personality prone to quick shifts in mood, comes from Mercury, the Roman name for Hermes, whose speed and constant movement between roles made him an apt namesake for changeable temperament. Martial comes from Mars, the Roman Ares, and Volcano borrows the name of Vulcan, the Roman Hephaestus, whose forge was imagined lying beneath the earth in locations that matched real volcanic activity across the Mediterranean. Arachnophobia recalls Arachne's transformation. Iridescent draws on Iris, goddess of the rainbow, and cereal, referring to grain crops and the food made from them, comes from Ceres, the Roman Demeter, a quiet, everyday survival of an ancient harvest goddess sitting on breakfast tables that have no other connection to antiquity at all. Aphrodisiac obviously connects to Aphrodite, and the phrase "under the aegis of," meaning under someone's protection, refers to the protective shield associated with both Zeus and Athena, the same one that carried Medusa's image at its center. Idioms borrowed wholesale from specific myths remain common as well. A Trojan horse, describing any deceptive gift concealing a hidden threat, is common enough that malicious computer programs disguised as legitimate software are still called Trojans today, naming an entire category of digital threat after a wooden horse built more than 2,500 years ago in story. A Pandora's box, describing any action that unleashes a cascade of unforeseen trouble, actually rests on a documented translation error, since the object Pandora carried was, in the original Greek, a large storage jar rather than any kind of box. a mistranslation traced back to the 16th century scholar Erasmus, whose Latin rendering apparently confused Pandora's jar with an entirely separate Greek fable involving a box, and whose version stuck firmly enough to permanently reshape how English speakers still picture the object today. And Psyche's own name, already met earlier through her story with Eros, gave the entire field of psychology its name. A mortal woman's story about longing and perseverance, now attached to the modern study of the mind. Even the planets carry these names forward, mostly through their Roman equivalents rather than the original Greek: Jupiter for Zeus, Neptune for Poseidon, Mars for Ares, Venus for Aphrodite. Uranus is often cited as the one exception, the only planet keeping a name derived directly from Greek rather than adopting a Roman substitute, though the full picture is a little more specific than that description suggests. The Romans did have their own equivalent to Uranus, a sky god called Caelus, and 18th century astronomers could technically have chosen that name instead. They settled on a Latinized form of the Greek Oranos, largely as a matter of the naming conventions and personal preference among the astronomers involved at the time, rather than reflecting any deeper pattern running through how the solar system as a whole came to be named. Chemistry and physics have drawn on the tradition too, with titanium named for the Titans in recognition of the metal's real strength, and chaos theory, though its modern mathematical meaning differs sharply from Hesiod's original yawning gap, still carries a faint echo of that same ancient sense of something formless and unpredictable sitting at the root of complex systems. Medicine has borrowed just as heavily. Hygeia and Panacea, both daughters of Asclepius, god of medicine, gave English the words hygiene and panacea respectively, the first referring to her association with cleanliness and preventive health, the second to her reputed ability to cure any ailment with the right remedy. The Achilles tendon, connecting calf muscle to heel bone and still known by that name in medical textbooks today, borrows directly from the same warrior already discussed at length, a permanent anatomical reminder of a story about a single vulnerable point on an otherwise formidable body. Eros gave English erotic, and Hermes, through a later mystical and alchemical tradition built around a legendary figure called Hermes Trismegistus, gave English hermetic, now used both for anything related to secret or occult knowledge, and, in a more physical sense, for anything sealed completely airtight. Since early alchemists believed their sealed vessels needed to be closed as securely as Hermes' own guarded knowledge. Psychology, already indebted to Psyche's own name for its very title, drew on this same mythology a second time. Sigmund Freud named the Oedipus complex after the Theban king already met earlier, borrowing the shape of his story, a son unknowingly bound up in conflict with his own father as shorthand for a particular stage of early childhood development, a use of the myth that has drawn considerable criticism and revision within psychology itself over the years since Freud first proposed it. The Cassandra complex, a less formal but still widely used term, describes the frustration of offering an accurate warning that no one believes, borrowed directly from the Trojan princess whose own gift of prophecy came bundled with a curse, ensuring she would never be trusted. And everyday speech carries its own smaller borrowings. Midas' touch describes anyone whose every venture seems to turn to profit, a phrase that keeps the reward from Midas' story while quietly dropping the cautionary weight. The original myth actually carried and the Hydra-headed problem describes any difficulty that seems to multiply the moment part of it is addressed, borrowed from the serpent whose severed heads only ever grew back in greater number. Two final borrowings connect the ancient world to fields quite far removed from mythology on the surface. The word Argonaut, describing any pioneer venturing into unfamiliar territory, whether scientific, artistic, or geographic, comes directly from Jason's own crew, and the term is still used today in exactly that spirit, applied to explorers, researchers, and early adopters of new fields well outside anything the original Argonauts themselves would have recognized. And the modern snake family python, encompassing some of the largest constricting snakes alive, well, takes its scientific name directly from the serpent. Apollo, killed to claim the oracle at Delphi, a naming choice made by 18th century naturalists reaching for something suitably imposing to describe an animal capable of growing to such an unusual size. One more word closes this particular list rather fittingly. Mnemosyne, the Titaness already introduced as mother of the 9 muses and personification of memory itself, gave English the word mnemonic, still used today for any technique or trick designed to help information stick in the mind, a small, quiet irony given how much of this account has relied on exactly that kind of memory. Carried forward across nearly 3,000 years by nothing more durable than people simply remembering and choosing to keep retelling what came before them. Whether the ancient Greeks actually believed these myths as literal history is a real, ongoing debate rather than a settled question. And the honest answer appears to be that belief varied a great deal depending on the story, the era, and the individual involved. Many ordinary Greeks likely treated stories about the Olympian gods with a flexible, somewhat symbolic understanding, while treating the heroic age, the Trojan War in particular, as a genuine, if distant and embellished historical event. That distinction gained real support once the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann began excavating a site in modern Turkey in the 1870s that he believed matched Homer's Troy, uncovering multiple layers of an ancient fortified city that had clearly existed, been destroyed, and been rebuilt several times across many centuries. This lent at least some physical weight to the idea that a real conflict, or series of conflicts, at that location may have fed into the oral traditions that eventually became Homer's poem. Even if the specific gods, individual heroes, and dramatic details themselves remain impossible to verify through excavation alone. Who Homer actually was, and whether one poet composed both the Iliad and the Odyssey at all, remains its own long-running scholarly debate known as the Homeric question. No reliable biographical information about Homer survives from antiquity, and the two poems show subtle enough differences in vocabulary and focus that some modern scholars have proposed they were composed by different individuals working within the same oral tradition rather than by a single author. A debate unlikely to ever be fully resolved, given how little concrete evidence survives from the period in which the poems were actually composed. One of the more striking confirmations connecting this mythology to real history came only in the middle of the 20th century, when a young architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris finally deciphered Linear B, an ancient script found on clay tablets across Mycenaean Greece. The Bronze Age civilization that likely provided at least some of the raw material behind the later, more legendary Trojan War tradition. Ventris's decipherment in 1952 revealed the tablets to be written in an early form of Greek. And among the everyday administrative records, lists of goods, workers, and offerings appeared several familiar names, including Poseidon, Zeus, and Hera, confirming that at least some of the major Olympian gods were already being worshipped by name centuries before Homer, in a period far closer to the Bronze Age setting the Trojan War itself is traditionally placed in. The mythology and the physical remains of that same Bronze Age world overlap in one more literal way. The massive stone walls surrounding Bronze Age citadels like Mycenae and Tiryns are built from boulders so large that later Greeks living centuries afterward found it hard to imagine ordinary human labor accounting for them, and they attributed the construction instead to the Cyclopes, the same one-eyed craftsmen already met at the very start of this account. Archaeologists still use the term Cyclopean masonry today as the standard technical name for this exact style of massive, irregular stone construction, a piece of modern academic vocabulary borrowed directly and quite deliberately from ancient Greek myth. A great deal of what is known about local myths and cult sites beyond the major literary sources comes from a Greek travel writer named Pausanias, who journeyed across Greece in the 2nd century CE and recorded, region by region, the temples, statues, and local legends he encountered along the way. A kind of ancient guidebook that has become an essential resource for modern archaeologists and historians trying to reconstruct how ordinary Greek communities, far from Athens or Delphi, understood and practiced their own regional versions of this same wider mythology. Pausanias' own observation that different regions favored different versions of the same underlying stories is worth underlining on its own. Athens naturally emphasized Athena and the myths connecting the city to her patronage. Sparta leaned more heavily on Ares and on martial virtue generally, and Thebes told its own local Theban cycle. The Oedipus and 7 Against Thebes stories already covered, with a regional pride roughly comparable to how Athens treated its own connection to Theseus. Modern visitors to the Louvre in Paris can still see one striking physical trace of this same devotion: a headless, larger-than-life marble statue of Nike, wings spread as though caught mid-landing on the prow of a ship, discovered on the island of Samothrace in 1863 and dated to around the 2nd century BCE. Among the most celebrated surviving works of ancient Greek sculpture, and a lasting physical reminder of how seriously a goddess mentioned only briefly in this account, victory itself was once deeply honored. Ideas about what happened to the soul after death also shifted across the centuries. This mythology stayed alive. Homer's Underworld, already described earlier, presents a fairly uniform, joyless existence for nearly everyone, with the shade of Achilles himself, encountered by Odysseus during his visit to its edge, famously declaring that he would rather serve as a poor farmhand for a landless man on earth than rule as king over all the dead. Later, religious movements within the wider Greek world, Orphism chief among them, tied to the mythical figure of Orpheus, and certain strands of Pythagorean philosophy introduced far more developed ideas about reincarnation and moral judgment after death, existing alongside rather than fully replacing the older, flatter Homeric picture. This same pattern, more than one truly different version of the same fundamental question circulating at once, runs beneath nearly everything gathered here, from the exact number of pomegranate seeds Persephone ate to the precise fate of Helen during the war fought supposedly over her. It was never a flaw in the system. It was closer to the whole point, a body of story loose and durable enough to be reshaped by each new generation of poets, philosophers, and ordinary households that found something in it worth passing along. A few more figures round out the picture, ones that did not fit neatly into any single earlier section, but are worth knowing regardless. The Amazons, a legendary society of warrior women, appear scattered throughout Greek myth as both opponents and occasional counterparts to various heroes. One of Heracles' 12 labors, not yet mentioned among the others, sent him to retrieve the girdle of their queen Hippolyta. And centuries later, within the Trojan War cycle, Achilles is said to have fought and killed another Amazon queen, Penthesilea, falling in love with her in one especially striking version of the story, the moment he realized what he had done. Ancient writers themselves debated whether any real historical basis lay behind Amazon legends, and modern archaeology has found some genuine supporting evidence in the form of armed female burials uncovered among Scythian and other steppe cultures north of the Black Sea. A real historical echo behind a still partly mythical tradition. Apollo's gentler associations with music and healing sit alongside a few episodes that resist softening. Niobe, a queen who boasted that her own 14 children made her more accomplished as a mother than Leto, who had only Apollo and Artemis, drew a punishment from the two gods severe enough that Niobe was said afterward to have wept without ceasing, eventually turned to stone by the gods in a final act. More like mercy than further punishment, a stone that was said to go on weeping water in the form of a natural spring, something ancient travelers claimed was still visible on Mount Olympus well into the historical period. Adonis, a strikingly handsome young mortal beloved by Aphrodite, became the center of an unusual dispute between the goddess of love and Persephone, queen of the Underworld. After Aphrodite entrusted the infant Adonis to Persephone's care, and Persephone grew too attached to give him back, Zeus settled the matter by having Adonis divide his year between the two goddesses, echoing the same seasonal rhythm already familiar from Demeter and Persephone's own arrangement. Adonis's name has survived into modern English as a word for any strikingly handsome young man, a compliment that carries no memory at all of the story's ending, since Adonis died young regardless, and Aphrodite's grief was said to have stained the anemone flower red. Hyacinthus offers a similar case. A beautiful young man beloved by Apollo, he died in a discus throwing accident, and the flower that sprang from his blood still carries his name today. One more entry in a long list of ordinary garden and roadside flowers, alongside the narcissus and the laurel already introduced, that the Greeks explained by tying them back to a particular story of love or loss. And a final small piece of language worth adding to everything already gathered, the word atlas, now used for any bound collection of maps, comes directly from the Titan, condemned to bear the weight of the sky, a naming choice popularized by the 16th century mapmaker Giraldus Mercator, who placed an image of Atlas holding up a globe on the cover of his own map collection, cementing an association between the Titan and cartography that has stuck ever since, even though, as already mentioned, the original myth describes Atlas bearing the sky rather than the earth itself. Sleep itself held a settled, gentle place within this same body of mythology, personified as Hypnos, already met at the very beginning through the word he gave the world. He was a son of Nyx, the primordial night introduced early on as well, and a twin brother to Thanatos, Death, the two of them living together in that same dim, quiet cave near the western edge of the world. No rooster crowed there, no dog barked, no branch stirred loudly enough to disturb it. Poppies grew thick around the entrance, and the gentle river Lethe, carrying forgetfulness in its current, flowed softly nearby. From that cave, Hypnos sent his many sons out each night to move through the sleeping world, among them Morpheus, capable of taking on the shape of any person to appear within a sleeper's dream, carrying comfort, warning, or simple company down into the ordinary rest of mortal life. Even Zeus himself was said to have been vulnerable to Hypnos' influence on at least one occasion, tricked into a deep sleep so that Hera could act freely elsewhere without her husband's notice, one of the very few moments across the entire tradition where the king of the gods was rendered powerless. Not through force or combat, but through the simple, universal pull of rest. Morpheus had brothers as well, together known as the Oneiroi, the collective spirits of dreams. Phobetor specialized in dreams involving animals, taking on the shapes of birds or beasts as he moved through a sleeper's mind, while Phantasos shaped dreams out of lifeless things entirely: earth, water, stone, and wood, giving even inanimate objects a strange, temporary life inside the sleeping imagination. Between the three of them, Morpheus, Phobetor, and Phantasos, the Greeks accounted for nearly every kind of dream a person might have, human, animal, or otherwise, all of it originating from the same quiet cave where their father kept his own endless, undisturbed rest. Nyx, the primordial knight who opened this account and who gave rise to Hypnos and his brother Thanatos, was also, according to Hesiod, the mother of Nemesis, the very goddess of retribution already met at the very beginning through the words she lent to modern language. It closes things well to end on that note that the same ancient night which produced sleep, dreams, and death also produced the force that ensures no pride goes forever unchecked. All of it part of one continuous family stretching from the first darkness at the start of everything to the quiet. Ordinary rest waiting at the end of an evening. Gathering everything scattered across all these smaller facts and stories. Gods with tempers and gods with gentleness, monsters born from grief, and monsters transformed into ordinary symbols of protection, words worn so smooth through everyday use that most people speaking them have long since forgotten the myths tucked quietly inside. An Odyssey, a Mentor, a Herculean effort, a Pandora's box waiting to be opened. All of it belongs to the same vast, loosely connected tradition, one that never needed a single fixed order to hold together. Only the ongoing willingness of each new generation to keep listening. And somewhere beneath all of it, gentler than the wars and the jealousies and the punishments handed down for pride, too openly displayed, sits that same small, steady figure in his dim cave by the edge of the world, keeping watch over rest itself, sending his sons out through the dark to carry whatever comfort a sleeping mind might need, waiting, as he always has, for the world above to grow quiet enough for him to do his own quiet work.